I'm going to be talking today about international standards for ecological restoration, which is something that is so important to me as someone who's worked in the field for all of my career. We are at a place now that I could never have imagined 20 years ago in terms of the scope and extent of ecological restoration. And so now that we have arrived at a time when we have the opportunity to accomplish so much, we need to make sure, in my view, that we're able to put our best foot forward. And part of that involves having a set of international standards that we can all use. Today, I'm going to be talking about the standards that the Society for Ecological Restoration adopted in 2016. Some of you may not know about the Society for Ecological Restoration, and some of you may be wondering why the Society for Ecological Restoration is the appropriate venue to be hosting the adoption of a set of standards. And so in my talk today, I hope to answer the question why we need standards, to talk about the inclusive process SCR used to create standards, and then to talk just a little bit about what is actually in the standards. It's a long document and there's too much to go through all of the points. Before I start though, I want to say that when people want to get to the same place, like improving our home, our planet, by repairing degraded ecosystems, or say getting from our hotel to our conference here at the university, right? Everyone has a different idea of the path to take. Even though we all want to get to the same place. For instance, we can go by the bus terminal, or we can stay in the traffic, right? But each person who's coming here and making those decisions is doing it with the right intention. And so I hope in this discussion of standards that we can all agree that we all are working towards creating better restoration for improvement of our planet. So with that as sort of my kind of framing of where the society's coming from, I will start. Okay, so many of us have been talking during the conference about particular restoration projects here in the region of Amazonia or in other places in Colombia or Latin America, or in my case, my work is in the Western United States or Chile. But all of this work aggregates up to the global scale. And we need restoration in all areas of our globe to contribute to improving the quality of our ecosystems and human well-being, because of course, the globe is connected. So Amazon forests are the lungs of the planet. What happens in other locations affects the Amazon region. We heard in previous presentations, including Pilar's presentation yesterday, about the high turnover of species that's going to occur here in tropical regions of our planet. And so we need this connection across the globe in order to foster species movements. The Society for Ecological Restoration was founded 30 years ago. We're celebrating our 30th birthday in order to promote restoration for the dual purposes and I've put the mission statement here, of sustaining biodiversity, life on Earth, and reestablishing healthy relationships between nature and culture, essentially human well-being. And I highlighted promote because since the establishment of this society, there have been a lot of advances. There have been scientific advances over the past 30 years that have been tremendous, both in the field of ecology, restoration ecology, and ecological restoration. But more than that, I'm completely blown away by the policy advances, right? Again, as I said in my opening, could any of you have imagined 15 years ago that we would have initiatives to protect 350 million hectares of land, of forest land, or 15% of degraded ecosystems? So the bond challenge, of course, is very important, with the initial target of 150 million hectares of forests and 300 million by 2030. In the United States, what this has translated into, and not just driven by the bond challenge, but our forest restoration program is ticking along at a rate of 9,000 projects per year, covering 2 million hectares of land per year in forest restoration in the US. And in the US, I'll talk a little more, but our problem, which doesn't sound like restoration to people in South America, where the focus is planting trees, is we have our native trees. The structure of our forests is what is causing the degradation, or is a consequence of the degradation. Initiative 2020 in Latin America, it was called 2020 because it was 20 million hectares by 2020. I don't know if probably someone here knows the actual number we're at now, but I believe it's over 60 million. Does anyone know? Okay. And then there's the Convention on Biological Diversity's strategic plan, which calls for 15% of degraded ecosystems to be restored by all the nations that signed the convention. There's also the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, which is a part of the CBD that's doing capacity building workshops across the planet and has grants available to increase the quality of restoration practice and funds for implementing activities. So, as I said, honestly, I'm amazed at the work we have done, and it's happened because of everybody here in this room and the work that you've been doing to instill in our society the importance of ecosystems, the importance of biodiversity, the link between ecosystems and society, and that restoration, this dream is possible, that we can have a better future. So now that we're here, the question is, what are we going to get from these initiatives 100 years from now? Will our children's children be proud of the work that we have done, and will they say, yeah, those folks at the turn of the century really knew what they were doing, they were thinking ecologically, and they were making good decisions? Or will, 100 years from now, our children's children's children need to fix the problems that we created by either trying to be restorative, but not getting things right, or by doing other kinds of commercial activities, but binning them as ecological restoration? And so I have 3 topics today. First, I want to talk about why are standards necessary? Some of you may be thinking that. Probably a lot of people who are thinking that are not here at my presentation. But you know, maybe you work on a project, you know, grassland restoration project in a community silvopasto project. So why do you need standards? You can work with the stakeholders in your area to figure out what you want to do. So I'll address that first. Secondly, I'll talk about SER's process at getting to where we are with international standards. And then third, I'll hit on a few key concepts in the standards that I think are important to share. They're not all innovative concepts, but they're ones that I'm excited that they're in our standards for the international community. Okay, I have 4 examples of why we need standards. The first is from grasslands in Brazil, which have been controversial with respect to forest landscape restoration. The second, this is a picture of forests outside of where I live. The forest restoration, those 44,000 treatments in the Western US. Third is a high-profile project in China. And the last one here is from Langa Forest near my research sites in Chile. Okay, so starting with Brazil. There was a large controversy when FLR first gained notoriety about opportunities for forest landscape restoration, because many of the opportunities for forest landscape restoration were areas that could support forests in terms of afforestation, but that were not in need of restoration. And an example are these grasslands in Brazil, and a debate ensued in Science magazine with some controversial titles about, you know, trees, protection of trees damaging other ecosystems, as well as this article that I've taken a figure from in Bioscience that shows in purple grassy biomes, in orange forest restoration opportunities, and in this darker orange red, grassy biomes at risk of afforestation. Hey, can someone move the projector just a tiny bit over? Yeah, awesome. So what this map shows, if you quantify it, is that there's 10 million hectares of grasslands, high biodiversity grasslands, important, yeah, perfect, important for protection, important for biodiversity, that were listed as targets for forest landscape restoration. Now, I don't think it was the intention of the FLR program to be promoting treatments in those areas. Rather, it was an unintended consequence of not having appropriate standards of what should be considered restoration. And so one need for standards is to ensure that when we're doing restoration treatments, we're not actually damaging ecosystems and biodiversity. My second example, it's really, to me, a sad story, a missed opportunity. It's about 44,000 forest restoration treatments implemented in the US between, let's see, 2008 and 2012 on 10 million hectares of land. And this map, each of the black dots here is a location of one of these treatments. And this map is of the 11 western states in the United States. And the issue why these treatments were initiated, our form of degradation is, as I said before, is that we have this situation of too many late cereal trees. And it's because of a change in our fire regimes, because we no longer allow fire in fire-adapted ecosystems. When there's no fire to remove these smaller trees, succession occurs, and you get highly hazardous forests. However, this situation is only one forest type. There are many different forest types in the United States, across the western states. So in my laboratory, we assessed restoration need across the 11 western states. And the area colored in orange are those areas that are predicted to have alteration in fire regimes, in other words, degradation. And therefore, you could say they could be in need of ecological restoration. What we found was that only 43% of those 44,000 treatments, and actually, I said that incorrectly because it's the area treated. Only 43% of area treated in those 44,000 treatments was in areas that actually was degraded. And so if you're doing treatments in areas that haven't been degraded, that can't be ecological restoration. And in fact, those treatments in areas that haven't been degraded have adverse consequences. And one is a loss of soil wood, which is the foundation of our ecosystems. When you remove soil wood from our temperate forests, you disentangle the entire system. In addition, these treatments always bring in invasive plants. This is a Eurasian weed, Bromus tectorum, which is incredibly devastating to our ecosystems. So the second reason we need standards is to make sure that restoration is being conducted where it's needed. You know, and my example also touched on that first one. If you're not doing restoration where it's needed, you may be doing harm. My third example is the Grain for Green program in China. China has a very rugged landscape and a lot of people, and people have been using incredibly steep slopes for agriculture, which has created a lot of land degradation. And so the Grain for Green program is really a program about stabilizing slopes by planting trees. So it's a reforestation program that has been called a restoration program and is being used to contribute to restoration targets. And of course, it's very important to stabilize those slopes for the communities, right? They have almost reached, in that one program, 30 million hectares of reforestation, and this is since 1990. So it's a huge amount of land, but 82% has been in monocultures using agricultural models. And I'm not saying that's not appropriate, but those models have resulted in some losses in biodiversity, including bees and birds in particular. And so to improve restoration and opportunities for improving our ecosystems, it would be helpful to clarify standards of how you achieve the best possible restoration. So here I have restorative activities and ecological restoration at the highest level. And the union is small. So standards might help us to move from this situation to this situation where we have a greater union. And it's up to communities to decide where they want to put their values. However, if we have standards that clearly communicate what trade-offs are, we may find that communities make different decisions. My last example is short. I put this slide in because I was telling someone about this experience in Chile. This is close to my research sites, and each of these blue containers has a dead plant, a dead lenga plant. And these plants are shade-tolerant trees, so they don't grow well in the open. And in addition, they're in these containers, which make them very hot, and they were planted in the wrong season. They were planted by a conservation organization that wanted to do the right thing. And they used volunteers, and people were probably very careful and, you know, gave a lot of attention to getting the plants in the ground. And there is over here, just off my photo, there's a picture, a plaque, talking about when the restoration was installed. But all we really got was educating the people about the importance of restoration, but through bad techniques, it's just plastic that someone's gonna have to go and remove. And so my last point is that we need standards to improve all the phases of restoration by clearly articulating to whomever is starting in the field of restoration what the steps are. And then finally, it would be totally fantastic in 2030 to say, not just we met our target and we did stuff on 350 million hectares, but actually that we accomplished restorative activities on those lands. And unless we have standards, the international community is not going to agree on what to count as restorative, what to count as ecological restoration. Standards are not a new concept, right? Here are standards from some other fields. This is for education, for health. These other fields have benefited from their standards. Restoration is a fairly young field, and so we have the potential with the development of standards. It's uncomfortable now to kind of put things on paper that set lines of what's restorative and what's restoration, but I think that they will over time be something that is regularly updated and important in the field. Okay, so now quickly, because it's not so interesting to hear just these facts, I want to tell those of you who are wondering, well, why should I care about standards made by the Society for Ecological Restoration? So I want to tell you about our process so you'll know how we got what we have. First of all, the Society has a chapter in Australasia, and that chapter is led by many of the Society's board members, or a few board members, and they got out of the gate first in developing standards. So that was an important document to use as a reference. We also used SCR's technical documents, we call them foundational, starting with the primer, which was in 2004. And those of you who used the primer, it's very well cited, probably are not so happy citing it anymore, right? Because it was from 2004 and really needs to be updated. And so the standards bring the primer from 2004 up to today in terms of ecological developments. There were several other documents, guidelines for developing and managing restoration projects, a document that was presented to the CBD on conserving biodiversity and the importance of restoration, and one that SCR collaborated with IUCN on in protected areas. And then finally, SCR has a code of ethics. So all of those went into the standards, but the idea was to infuse the standards with emerging concepts. It was not a small group who worked on the standards. SCR used a participatory approach. There were 65 individual experts who participated, just a few as authors, but as reviewers, and many of those reviewers actually provided substantial portions of text. Was it equal among all countries and all regions? No, it was not. But that reflects SER's distribution of members. But the attempt was to include as many people as possible. It was presented at the COP in Cancun, Mexico in 2016. To be honest, SER hurried in order to present it at the COP because we felt having standards was so important to the well-being of the field of ecological restoration. When it was presented, however, it was presented as a living document. And so immediately the society began working on a revised version, and there were several points for input, including an online survey that was open for 6 months, and a workshop in Iguazu at the conference, which some of you attended here, in which we had 50 experts, several concurrent sessions on the standards, and a knowledge cafe at the conference. The idea behind the standards is that they would apply to every ecosystem. So that means that they're not prescriptive. It's not a cookbook of what you do. Rather, general principles and approaches and information about the process that should be used in order to achieve restorative activities and restoration. Okay, so I need to move quickly so we can stay on time, the conference. So I'm going to present 4 key concepts in the standards. All of these would be amazing to have an opportunity to sit, I'd say each one for 3 hours, and discuss over refreshments. But we don't have time to do that at this conference, especially because I unfortunately have to leave on a flight at 1 o'clock. But if anyone is interested, follow up with me for sure. We can arrange some time to talk. One of my favorite contributions of the standards is the concept of a restorative continuum. The revised version has a better figure. This is the old figure because I wasn't sure if I could share the new content. The idea, as I said, is that, the restorative interventions are varied. They go from silvopastoral systems all the way to, the highest effort ecological restoration. And they all need to be recognized for their contributions. We don't need to put a line and say you need to achieve this much in order to be counted. It can all get counted, recognizing that there's a gradient, right? Another concept is that ecological restoration over here, and it's been called 5-star recovery, and I'll explain why later, it aims for the best that we can do. And it may only be appropriate in a limited portion of the landscape. Another concept is that you need to work with local actors and involve them at the beginning of projects. That's, of course, a very obvious concept, I think, to most of us in this room. However, the global initiatives often start with maps at the national scale, forgetting that it's local people who are going to implement these projects. And of course, restoration can't succeed unless there's strong social objectives and unless the local people care about those projects. The revised version of the standards has much more focus on that. It was a deficiency in the first version. Okay. The next point is about what are our targets in ecological restoration, right? We heard from Pilar. Pilar set me up perfectly for this conversation. Actually, I'm going to just rip right through some of my slides here. I probably should have pulled them, because this idea of returning to the past is completely inconsistent with the inherent attributes of ecosystems, and also the human's effect on our climate. And so, you know, this inherent property of ecosystems, I have an ecosystem in this bottle, and of course it will change. We all know that. So it's interesting that as managers, this complexity of temporal change is too much for us. And so therefore, we throw our knowledge of ecology out the window and decide we're going to use an historic target or something else that doesn't make a lot of ecological sense. And Pilar talked about clements yesterday, and the fact that we've moved over 100 years from this idea that nature is nature where it's supposed to be and species stay with their communities, to knowledge based on modern techniques like pollen analysis that everything is changing, right? You can take a column of soil and see the pollen from up to 13,000 years ago. And here are changes from outside of University of Washington in Seattle. And you can see starting 13,000 years ago, there was pinus, right? And spruce. And then rapidly, there was a change, extremely rapidly. Oh, I forgot to say, sorry, this is the percentage of pollen. So this is 92% of pollen. So 92% of the trees there were pinus, and then over time, you see these dramatic changes to the current flora that we have today. Okay, what does this mean for restoration? This concept of natural range of variability doesn't make sense, because there's no natural bounds of the way things should be. You can measure historic range of variability, and that is useful to do. We don't have time to talk too much about that. But it doesn't mean that it's relevant in the future. And so, of course, interventions should not establish historic conditions. So this idea that you have a biophysical envelope, some ecosystem condition that's been degraded in the present, this can't be what restoration is about, right? Restoration is about removing degradation and returning the system to the trajectory it would have been on if it had not been degraded in the first place. And as a concept, that is clear, seems clear, right? It's not the original or the old condition, and it's allowing a continued trajectory of change. Historic information, is it important? It is, because you need it in order to determine degradation, but not as an endpoint of restoration. There's so much to talk about here in terms of how you operationalize the concept of a reference model. Modern analogs are what I use in my research lab, as well as successional models, empirical or theoretical. And then we must account for climate change as well. Okay, so what I'm talking about again for these reference models is this part of our continuum. To be clear, in these other areas, there may be many different goals, and the ecosystem service and ecosystem service may be the ultimate goal of the project. There's some pitfalls in developing reference models very quickly. There's variability among ecosystems. You can't have just one reference site. It's a model, and the standards say that. You have to consider successional stage, and you have to consider equilibrium dynamics. Some places, tundra in Alaska, single equilibrium endpoint, and apologies, but I don't have time to explain this graph, but suiting has done a lot of work in this area. Other systems have multiple or non-equilibrium dynamics, and that needs to be factored into the models. The second inherent property is complexity. Pilar set me up perfectly, as well as Patrick. So we've had a lot of content here about the importance of bioregulation between plants and soils, structural complexity, all kinds of complexity in ecosystems. We can't be creating ecosystems that look like this for our highest level of restoration. So what is the significance of this inherent attribute? We need to, for our reference ecosystems, consider a wide variety of indicators. The last key concept in the standards I want to mention is this recovery wheel. The recovery wheel is in the process of revision. But it shows on a scale of 1 to 5, and for a variety of indicators for each of these attributes, the process of restoration, how it's affected each of these indicators. And that's a very useful tool. We've been doing this in restoration science for a while as a response ratio. This is from Moreno Mateus, and it shows for vertebrates, macroinvertebrates, and plants over time what percentage, what proportion achieved of the reference based on 600 wetlands. Whoops. And they did the same thing for other variables, hydrologic, biochemical. Okay. I love this because it allows me to transform the recovery wheel not into 5 stars, but to quantify them in terms of percent recovery. And I put in a caveat because this is my slide and not in the standards. Okay, so wrapping up here, the second edition of the standards will be out in October of 2018. It's in final revision, so the process of feedback and commentaries is officially closed, but it's still under review. However, if you would like to make your voice heard, I encourage you to work with SER, because not just on these standards, but for all the global initiatives and engaging with the CBD and the Bond Challenge, we need more representation from many parts of the world. And so your ideas are important. SER, as the society, the brand is the science behind the practice, right? SER is our members and our members' input. And so we need your voice, especially if you think the standards are not the way you would drive. Come to the table and we will be revising them again. We have other programs that could use your input, like the Certified Practitioner Program, which is available across all countries in the world. There's a call now open for applications that closes in October. If you're interested, you can look at the SER website at the certification program. Again, maybe you'll look at the program and say, for Colombia, there's a huge gap. And if that's the case, please come and join us, and so we can improve the work we're doing. You know, it's really up to all of us now that we've arrived at this place with restoration. You know, let's not lose our opportunity to do the best that we can. I looked at how many environmental organizations there are in the United States, and it was 65,000 in the United States. If the density of environmental groups per person in the United States is true across the world, which it probably isn't, you get 1.5 million environmental groups across the planet. You know, we have the workforce and the capacity, and it would be fantastic to make the best decisions we can, and also to work amicably across nations and across ecosystems and sectors. in order to understand the kernel of truth from other people's perspectives to improve for all of us. Thank you.